We are going to take a look at a story from John's Gospel today. But before we go to that story, I'd like to remind you of what Pastor Don shared with us on Christmas Eve. If you were here, you might recall he spoke about how John's Gospel begins at a different place than the other Gospels, that John went all the way back to the beginning, to Genesis, when in the prologue to the Gospel, he speaks about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word was God, the Word was with God, pointing us later to the fact that the Word, the living Word, was Jesus Christ. And throughout John's Gospel, we're reminded again and again that Jesus was the Son of God, with an emphasis, a little more emphasis on his divinity than we find in the other Gospels. Jesus himself reminded his listeners in words that were quoted in John's Gospel that he was going to return to the place from which he was sent. And he wasn't talking about Nazareth. Christ's place with God and his divinity are revealed to us earlier and more frequently in John's Gospel than any of the others. Now, the first 12 chapters of John's Gospel are often called the Book of Signs because those chapters contain the stories of 7 miracles, which John called miracles, signs, that Jesus performed in his ministry. And the word sign is really appropriate, if you think about it, rather than miracle, because these signs were signposts that Jesus used and that we use today when we read the stories to point toward Christ's position as God's Son, toward his divinity, and toward God. So indeed, they were signs, they were signposts. Now, our story today is the text about the very first sign. We find it early in John's Gospel in chapter 2. It takes place at a wedding. It includes a miracle. It includes an exchange between a mother and a son that might surprise us a little. But in the end, there occurs a miraculous sign that teaches us a couple of very important things about God's character and about Jesus's character. I'm going to read to you from John's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, this story of the first sign at the wedding is a happy one. It might even evoke a smile or a chuckle. I mean, after all, we worship a Lord and King who enjoyed happy celebrations with his family, with his friends. He was okay with wine, as we see again and again in the Gospels. Even as an adult, his mama tried to tell him what to do. But the words he spoke to her in reply sound much worse to our ear today than they would have sounded in Jesus' time. As readers of the whole Bible, including the end of John's Gospel, we know that Jesus loved his mother very much. And even as an adult, pleasing her was probably important to him. But friends, there are deeper meanings to this story and lessons for us to learn that go beyond the miracle that took place. We learn that God's blessings, God's provisions are extravagant, just like we sung about a few minutes ago. The wine Jesus made was the very best served, and he provided it somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons if you do the math. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm thinking that everybody at that wedding was going to need to call an Uber and give up their car keys that night when it was time to go home. But what struck me most about this story was that Jesus changed his mind. When he first replied to his mother, saying, "Woman, why do you involve me? My time hasn't come yet," we probably assumed that that was a hard no. And yet, turns out, he decided to get involved, to change his time schedule, and based on the request of his mother, Jesus, who's fully human and fully divine, changed his mind and provided the wine. This raises a couple of questions that I think are important for us to consider. Many of us come from different faith backgrounds from when we were children. Some of us have been United Methodists our whole life. Some of us have come from other faith backgrounds. And one of the things that is often taught to us is that God is immutable. And immutable is a big churchy word that means unchangeable. So if God is unchangeable, does God change God's mind? And can we influence God to change his mind? There is a widely held belief today in many corners of the church universal that God doesn't change his mind. I can even find a verse for you in Psalms that said God doesn't change his mind. But there are other scriptures that might suggest otherwise. So if that's what you've been taught, and that's what you believe, I ask that you pretend today that you're on a jury, and that I'm a prosecutor, and I'm going to present evidence, maybe to the contrary of what you've always held as true. And when I'm done presenting the evidence, you get to decide, like you do every Sunday. When Pastor Don and I get up here and we deliver a message to you, it is not our demand that you agree with everything you hear from us. We hope, though, if you disagree, that you'll at least think about the things that we say. And if you do that today, that will be enough. Now, in Genesis, we find a story involving Abraham, Allison. Boy, your name just went away there for a minute. that Allison just spoke about. Abraham was a faithful man. He learned from God that God was planning to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because the cities were so wicked. And after God revealed that plan to Abraham, Abraham confronted God, basically, in a conversation that was pretty bold, but at the same time respectful. Part of what he said was this. He said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" And then he continues and goes on, and when God agrees to spare the cities, if there's 50 righteous people, there's an almost comical exchange where Abraham keeps lowering the number to 45 and 40 and 30, and they finally arrive with God saying he won't destroy the cities if they can find 10 righteous people. But if you think about what Abraham said to God, it was pretty bold. The implication was that if God carried out his plan and destroyed righteous people with the unrighteous, that he would be unjust. Abraham, in a very bold but respectful way, asked God to be just. Well, because God is just. Do you know what happened? God changed his mind. Lot and his family were treated by God as righteous. And when the cities proved to be terribly wicked, Lot and his family were led away from the city, and then the cities were destroyed. And the only one of his family who didn't survive was his wife, because she didn't obey the instructions she had been given to not turn back and look at the cities. And when she turned back and looked, she turned into a pillar of salt. So she wasn't righteous because she was disobedient. Obedient, faithful Abraham dared to demand that God be just as God teaches us to be just. In Exodus, we find more evidence. There's a story after Moses leads the people out of Egypt where they were enslaved, and they're going through the wilderness, and at one point they stop at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses leaves the people behind and goes up on the mountain to receive the law, the 10 Commandments from God. God carves them on a tablet. But while Moses is up there, the people get restless and tired of waiting for him to return, and so they demand that Moses' brother Aaron, who's the priest, create an idol for them, the story of the golden calf. Well, God realized that they rebelled while Moses was with him, and this is the conversation that takes place between Moses and God. And it begins with God saying, "I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land that I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever." Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. God's mind was changed. Moses' words may seem manipulative. Well, if you do that, God, the Egyptians are going to think this of you, and you don't want them to think that. But God knew that Moses was a faithful servant. He had done hard things God asked him to do, just like Abraham had many, many centuries before. God reconsidered his plan. So let's jump to the New Testament. Not just the story I read to you earlier about the wedding in Cana, but let's go to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 15. There's a story there where a Canaanite woman, not a Jew, comes up to Jesus and cries out to him to heal her daughter. And first, Jesus doesn't answer her, and the disciples get agitated and say, "Lord, send her away. She's bugging us." And the woman comes and kneels at his feet and asks again for his help. And this time he did reply to her, saying words that feel harsh to me today, and they might feel harsh to you. But what Jesus said is, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Now, he said this after telling her that his ministry was only to be to the people of Israel. And he says it's not right to take the bread and throw it to the dogs. And instead of responding in anger, like many of us might do, I know I probably would if somebody talked to me that way, the woman retained an attitude of humility and said to him, "Yes, it is. It is right. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." And Jesus relented. He changed his mind. He praised her faithfulness, and he healed her daughter. So what do we learn from these stories, along with the story of Jesus changing water into wine? Was God influenced by his interactions with people? Did God change his mind? Seems to me that the answer to both questions is yes, with a couple of very important qualifiers. First, the people who were making the requests were faithful and believed, with the exception of the Canaanite woman who Jesus didn't know before that instance. These were people who had done the things that God asked. These are people who demonstrated obedience and trust in God. Second, the requests were important. They weren't asking God to be, celestial vending machine providing every little trivial thing that they wanted. And third, the folks making the requests, they were really humble. They didn't act entitled, even though their requests were bold. So let's return to that wedding story and look at some of the biblical figures, the characters in that story. Mary, she didn't nag Jesus in the face of his reply. She didn't bug him and make him angry. She simply trusted that the son who she knew would do the right thing. The servants who were asked to do a gigantic task, 20 gallons to 30 gallons a jar for 6 jars is somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons of water, if you do the math. That's a lot of water hauling and filling, and the jars were heavy. Mary told them, "Do what he tells you to do." And they did. Jesus asked a lot of them, heavy labor, and they did it without knowing the end of the story, without knowing what was going to come from his request. And as a result, they witnessed a sign, a miracle that the other people present didn't realize had happened. Now, I can't tell you what Jesus was thinking. Maybe he thought, in Aramaic, whatever the Aramaic way would have been of saying, "I wish Mom would butt out." Maybe he thought, well, there's no time like the present to reveal God's glory through me. Maybe he was just being a very human son who decided that it was nice to please his mama, even as he was a fully divine son that knew it was good to reveal God's glory in the presence of some witnesses. And then there's the disciples. They understood what had happened. They witnessed the miracle, and they believed. And as is so often the case with the disciples, the 12 closest to him, it took a miracle for them to believe. And then there's the other wedding guests. They had no idea what happened. They were just partying. They went on partying without understanding. The steward of the banquet gave the credit to the bridegroom and his family for producing this wonderful wine. And the crowd partied on until it was time to call that Uber. So, who are we in this story today, reading it thousands of years later? Are we a member of the oblivious crowd that would need a ride home? Or are we one of those few obedient servants who did a hard task without knowing what the outcome would be just because Jesus asked? Are we the disciples, the variety of which need to see a miracle in order to believe? Or are we that sweet, faithful believer, Mary, who knew her son intimately and trusted that he would do what was needed? At different times in my life, I've been every one of those characters in the story. But what I've come to understand is that our requests to God matter. Our faithfulness matters. Our obedience matters. Our humility matters. And our choice to do or not do what He tells us to do matter. I do believe that God's character is immutable and unchangeable. God is always good, always loving, merciful, and just. Although God's timing is often God's and God's alone. We don't necessarily get what we hope for in the time that we hope for it, but God manages to give us what we need even when we ask for the wrong stuff. I also believe that our prayers, our requests, and our actions influence God's decision, and that sometime God changes His plans based on what we ask or say or do. I mean, as Wesleyans, we believe that God created us, giving us free will that's not coerced. God didn't pre-orchestrate every single thing that you or I do. There are traditions that believe that, but we don't. If that were the case, we as Methodists believe that we would just be puppets on strings being pulled by God. But God gives us free will to choose, which then forces God to act based on the choices we make, whether the choices we make are the ones God hoped for or the one God didn't hope for. So friends, you be the jury. For me, the verdict has already been decided by God's self-revelation in Scripture, both in God's actions in the Old Testament and in Jesus' actions in the New Testament. Prayer does change things. Prayer does influence God. Actions that we take do change things. And sometimes our actions give God delightful opportunities to reveal God to us in the present, here and now, today. I hope you'll think about all of this. The academic question of what immutable means isn't really what's important here. What's important are our decisions to be like the servants at the wedding who get asked to do this big, giant thing, not having any idea how it's going to turn out. Just trusting that we should do what Jesus asks. It's important for us to be like Mary, not nagging, not griping, just believing and trusting that God would provide what was necessary. If you remember just one thing from this message today, I hope you will remember the words that Mary spoke to the servants. Let them ring in your ears. Let them become your motto for the week, for the month, for the rest of your life. Do what He tells you to do. And if you do that faithfully, with eyes to see and ears to hear, you just might witness a miracle. Amen? Amen.